They stood naked. They were shivering. And they were absolutely certain they were about to die. It is 1945. These are German women, captured near the front lines, now standing in a tiled room deep inside the United States. For years, the Nazi regime had brainwashed them. They were told the Americans were gangsters. They were told that capture meant torture, slavery, or a cold death in a work camp. So when the American guards ordered them to strip and marched them into a room filled with pipes and industrial valves, they didn't see a bathroom. They saw an execution chamber. They squeezed their eyes shut. They clenched their fists, waiting for the freezing water, or perhaps gas. The plumbing rattled. The guards turned the handles. The women screamed inside their heads. But then, the steam hit them. It wasn't ice. It wasn't poison. It was heat. Glorious, high-pressure, blistering heat. And then, a hand reached through the steam. It didn't hold a rifle. It held a small, white, rectangular block. It didn't smell like war. It smelled of lavender. It smelled like peace. It was a bar of soap. This isn't a story about a battle. It's the true, untold story of how a simple shower broke the spirit of the enemy faster than a bullet ever could. While Europe was burning, a group of German women stepped into the golden cage of American captivity and faced a culture shock so profound, it shattered their loyalty to the Third Reich forever. They expected a dungeon. Instead, they got Palmolive. Welcome to our channel. Today, we are uncovering the psychological earthquake caused by the simplest luxury of all. To truly understand the shock of that hot shower in America, we first have to understand the depth of the filth they left behind. By late 1944 and early 1945, cleanliness in Germany was no longer routine. It was a distant memory. The infrastructure of the Third Reich hadn't just cracked. It had been obliterated. For the women serving near the front lines, the Wehrmachtelfernen, female auxiliaries, the signal staff, and the nursing corps, life had devolved into a primitive struggle for survival. The Allied bombing campaigns had shattered the water mains in major cities. There was no running water. There was no electricity to heat what little water could be scavenged from craters or stagnant rivers. And soap? Soap had vanished years ago. In its place was Riffsafe, a gritty, clay-based substitute that barely lathered and felt like rubbing sand against your skin. But by the end, even that was gone. On the black market, a real bar of pre-war French or American soap was worth more than a wedding ring. It was worth more than gold, because without it, you were rotting alive. For these women, the loss of hygiene was a loss of humanity. Imagine wearing the same wool uniform for 3 weeks straight. It is stiff with sweat, mud, and engine grease. It rains, and the wool smells like wet dog and mold. It dries, and it crusts over. You sleep in it, you work in it, and you bleed in it. Then there were the lice. They weren't just a nuisance. They were a crawling, living plague. In the trenches and the makeshift field hospitals, lice were everywhere. They lived in the seams of the uniforms, feasting on the warmth of human bodies. The women would spend their few spare moments shirt reading, picking lice out of their collar by candlelight, but it was a losing battle. The itching was constant. It was a psychological torture that never stopped, a reminder that they were living like animals. But the physical filth was only half the nightmare. The other half was the terror planted in their minds. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, knew the end was near. To keep the soldiers and support staff fighting, they had to terrify them. They spun wild, horrific lies about the Americans. The women were told that the Americans were gangsters from Chicago and cowboys with no moral compass. They were told that American society was a lawless wasteland and that U.S. soldiers were barbarians who would abuse, torture, and enslave any German woman they captured. They were told that surrender wasn't an option because the Americans would treat them with the same medieval brutality that was occurring on the frozen Eastern Front. They believed that if they were captured, they would be stripped of everything: their clothes, their dignity, and their lives. When the collapse finally came, it was total chaos. As the American lines advanced, these women were caught in pockets of resistance, hiding in cellars, bunkers, or retreating field hospitals. The moment of capture was the nadir of their lives. Try to picture the scene. The air is filled with the smell of cordite and unwashed bodies. You are exhausted, malnourished, and terrified. Then you see them, the Americans. They look like giants. They were well-fed, their uniforms were intact, and they chewed gum with a casual confidence that was terrifying to the starving Germans. When the women were rounded up, the smell of defeat was literal. They were caked in the mud of the Rhineland, stained with oil and reeking of sickness. They were marched onto transport trucks and then loaded onto Liberty ships docked at French ports. As they were herded into the cramped holds of these massive steel vessels, the panic set in. They huddled together in the dark, the ship's engines vibrating through the metal floor. In their minds, they weren't going to a prisoner of war camp. In their minds, they were being shipped to hell. They whispered to each other in the dark, wondering if they would be worked to death in American mines or left to freeze in the Arctic. They sat there, clutching their dirty, lice-ridden uniforms, bracing for the end. They had no idea that they were currently leaving a starving, broken continent for the land of plenty. They didn't know that the hell waiting for them was paved with chocolate, white bread, and the one thing they thought they'd never see again, hot water. The psychological shift began before they even reached the camps. It started the moment they stepped off the transport ships and onto the trains. But first, there was the food. The shock had actually started days earlier, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. On the transport ships, the German prisoners braced themselves for starvation rations, perhaps a crust of moldy bread or watery soup, which was standard fare in collapsing Reich. Instead, they were handed trays pile high. They saw things they hadn't seen in years. White bread that was soft as a cloud, thick slabs of butter and meat. Real meat. Some of the women wept while eating. Others were suspicious, whispering that this was a hangman's meal, a final feast before execution. But the execution never came. Lunch did, and then dinner. By the time they docked in New York or Boston, their confusion was total. They were led to waiting trains to be transported inland to internment camps scattered across the Midwest and the South. In Europe, prisoners of war were moved in cattle cars, wooden boxes without windows, seats, or toilets, where men and women stood for days in their own filth. Here, they were ordered to board passenger trains. They sat on cushioned velvet seats. There was heating. There were glass windows, clean and clear, offering a panoramic view of the enemy's homeland. As the trains chugged westward, the women looked out the windows, expecting to see the scars of war. They looked for the bomb craters that pockmarked every square mile of Germany. They looked for the burnout skeletons of buildings. They looked for the misery they had been told was universal. Instead, they saw America. They saw a landscape of aggressive, terrifying abundance. They saw fields of corn and wheat that stretched for hours, uninterrupted by a single crater. They saw silos bursting with grain, food that could feed the world, let alone an army. They saw cattle grazing in peace, fat and healthy. The sheer size of the country was a weapon in itself. In Europe, you cross a border every few hours. In America, the train traveled for days, and the landscape never ended. It was a demonstration of scale that the German mind, conditioned by the claustrophobia of the bunkers, couldn't comprehend. Then came the cities. As evening fell, the prisoners prepared themselves for blackout. In Germany, showing a light at night meant death from above. Cities were tombs of darkness to hide from Allied bombers. But outside the train windows, America blazed with light. They passed towns glowing with street lamps. They saw neon signs flickering over diners and theaters. They saw cars, hundreds of them, driving down paved roads with their headlights on, unafraid. It was a visual assault. The lights proved that the American home front was untouchable. The bombers weren't coming here. The war hadn't touched this place. For the women staring out those windows, the realization was more painful than any physical blow. The propaganda machine in Berlin had told them that Germany was winning, or at least holding the line against a weak enemy. They were told the U-boats were starving America, but looking at the factories humming with activity, the endless lines of freight trains carrying tanks and jeeps, and the peace of the countryside, the math became undeniable. One prisoner later recalled the silence in the train car. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was a silence of grief. They realized that their husbands, brothers, and sons weren't dying to save Germany. They were dying for nothing. The war had been lost a long time ago, not on the battlefield, but here, in the infinite resources of a continent that didn't even know the meaning of scarcity. They felt small. They felt betrayed by their leaders who had lied to them. And they felt a strange, creeping envy. As the train finally slowed, approaching the barbed wire fences of the internment camp, the women gathered their few belongings. They were mentally shattered. They had seen the enemy's power, and it had broken their spirit. But they were still covered in the filth of Europe. They still wore the lice-ridden uniforms of the retreat. They stepped off the train, entering the processing center, expecting an interrogation or cell. They didn't realize that the American obsession with efficiency and hygiene was about to collide with their reality. The guards weren't reaching for weapons. They were reaching for towels. The biggest shock of their lives was just behind the shower doors. Arrival at the camp processing center was a blur of noise and confusion. The golden cage didn't feel golden yet. It felt like a prison. The guard shouted orders in English, a sharp, barking language that most of the women didn't understand. They were herded into a large, tiled room that smelled of antiseptic and damp concrete. Then came the order that every prisoner dreads. Strip. The humiliation was immediate. These were women who had been raised in a conservative society, now forced to undress in front of strangers. They piled their filthy, lice-ridden uniforms into a corner, a mound of gray wool and mud that represented the last 3 years of their lives. But as they stood there, naked and vulnerable, shivering in the cool air of the processing center, a different kind of fear took hold. A cold, paralyzed silence fell over the room. They looked up at the ceiling. They looked at the metal fixtures protruding from the pipes. Showers. In the dark rumors of Europe, specifically regarding the Eastern Front and the camps run by their own government, showers had a horrific double meaning. They knew the stories. They knew that sometimes water didn't come out of those pipes. Panic began to set in. Some women began to weep silently. Others prayed, clutching their own arms, waiting for the gas, waiting for the end. The American guards, oblivious to the specific psychological terror, simply turned a valve. The plumbing rattled and groaned. The women flinched. And then the water hit them. It wasn't gas. It wasn't freezing cold water meant to punish them. It was a high-pressure torrent of hot, steaming water. For a woman who hadn't felt hot water on her skin in 6 months, or perhaps years, the sensation was overwhelming. It was a physical shock so intense it felt like a blow. The heat penetrated their skin, soaking into muscles that had been tense with fear for weeks. The room instantly filled with thick white steam, obscuring the guards and the fences outside. It was physical ecstasy. One prisoner described it as the moment her soul returned to her body. But the Americans weren't done. As the women stood there, stunned, letting the water run over their faces, the guards began passing out supplies. They didn't just wash them down with a hose like cattle. They handed out individual hygiene kits. In their hands, the women held bars of commercially produced American soap. To the American GI, this was nothing. A few cents at the commissary, a basic necessity. But to the German prisoners, this was a brick of solid gold. They brought it to their noses. It didn't smell like the gritty clay-based Riff soap they had back home, which smelled of sand and chemicals. This smelled of lavender. It smelled of flowers, milk, and perfume. It smelled of a world at peace. They began to scrub. They lathered the soap, watching bubbles form, actual rich white foam. They scrubbed until their skin turned red. They clawed at their scalps, washing their hair aggressively. They watched the water swirling around their feet turn dark brown. It was the mud of the Rhineland. It was the grease of the transport trucks. It was the lice that had plagued them for months. They watched the filth of the war circle the drain and disappear. For 20 minutes, the war didn't exist. They weren't prisoners. They were just women in a shower. The layers of trauma were literally being washed away. The final blow to their worldview came when the water turned off. They stepped out of the steam, expecting to be handed their old, dirty rags back. Instead, they were handed towels. Clean, fluffy, white cotton towels. One prisoner later wrote about this specific moment. She said that as she dried herself with that towel, feeling the softness against her clean skin, She realized the lies of the Nazi regime. She realized that barbarians, as the Americans were called, do not offer their prisoners hot showers and scented soap. She realized that only a nation with infinite resources and a fundamentally different moral code could afford such luxury for the enemy. The soap had done what bullets couldn't. It convinced them that the American way of life was superior. They were clean, and for the first time in a long time, they were safe. That shower did more than just scrub away the dirt of the Rhineland. It began to wash away the fanaticism that had been drilled into them for a decade. You have to remember, these women had been indoctrinated to believe that the Third Reich was the pinnacle of civilization and that America was a cultural wasteland. But as the water swirled down the drain, that ideology went with it. You cannot maintain a belief in your enemy's barbarism when that enemy has just handed you a towel that smells of lavender. This experience wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a mistake by a single kind guard. It was systemic. It became a defining memory for hundreds of thousands of German POWs, both men and women, held across the United States. They came to call their imprisonment the Golden Cage. In the weeks that followed that first shower, the shocks kept coming. They were marched into mess halls and given trays of food that defied belief. They were fed the same caloric rations as American GIs, meat, milk, vegetables, and desserts. In Germany, people were boiling shoe leather for soup. Here, the prisoners were gaining weight. They had access to libraries filled with books that had been banned in Germany. They played sports. They watched Hollywood movies. And yes, they had access to daily hot showers. The terror they had been promised by Goebbels never materialized. Instead, they found themselves guests of a nation so wealthy that it treated its prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers. When the war finally ended and these women were repatriated to Germany, the contrast was heartbreaking. They returned to cities that were nothing but hollowed-out shells. They returned to families that were starving, shivering in cellars without coal or glass in windows. But the women returning from the Golden Cage were different. They were healthy. They were clean. And most importantly, their minds had been changed. They didn't go back as sleeper agents or enemies of America. They went back as witnesses. When their neighbors or bitter relatives spat on the ground and cursed the American gangsters, these women would stop them. They would tell the story of the shower. They told stories of a land where soap was so plentiful, they gave it to the enemy for free. They told stories of a country that didn't need to steal from occupied nations to feed its people. They told stories of a victor that could afford to be humane. In the end, that simple bar of soap became a symbol more powerful than a tank. A tank represents hard power. It forces you to submit. But a bar of soap, that represents soft power. It represents a logistical dominance so complete that it breaks your will to fight. To give soap to a prisoner is a flex. It says, we have so much of this. We don't even care if you use it. It proved to the German soldiers and nurses that they never stood a chance against the American industrial machine. But it also represented mercy. In the middle of the deadliest conflict in human history, when hate was a fuel of the world, that shower was a moment of unexpected grace. It restored their dignity when they expected to be treated like animals. So, the next time you step into a hot shower after a long day and you reach for that bar of soap, take a second to really appreciate it. Feel the warmth. Smell the scent. Because once, 70 years ago, that simple, mundane act was enough to dismantle the lies of a totalitarian regime. It was enough to convince an enemy that they had already lost the war, and that, perhaps, being captured by the Americans was the best thing that could have ever happened to them. What do you think? If you had been raised to hate an enemy, would a hot shower and a good meal be enough to change your mind? Or was this just a case of Stockholm Syndrome with better amenities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look into the hidden side of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We dig up the stories of history books left out.